Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome author Richard Kurin and moderator Geoff Cowan.
Time here. Is this amazing? I mean, what an incredible event this is. And this isn't really going to be a talk. This is show and tell. But before the show and tell starts, let me just get a little sense of the audience. How many of you have been to some part of the Smithsonian? You have no idea. And who wants to actually go to the Smithsonian's attic? Okay, well, you're going to find out things here. This book, this man, and of course this institution is actually a revelation. And the Smithsonian is something so incredible. I've been thinking about if you really were interested in American culture and or popular culture and Americana generally and American history, you couldn't dream of a better job or better career than Richard Kurin's had. He's an anthropologist by training. He actually did field work in South Asia, which is his expertise. He's lived in fascinating communities around the world. He's helped to draft treaties. He has some of the most amazing titles that I think you invented for yourself because he has this job which lets him do it. So he has an ambassadorial title, and he has a provostial title, and he has an undersecretary of this and that title. It's really quite extraordinary. And on top of that, he actually runs truly one of the great institutions. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a sense through Richard Kurin, not just of this book, which you, I hope, will have a chance also to see and to buy, but really of this amazing institution which he does so much to run. So please join me in welcoming Richard Kurin.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, we have so much to cover, but people think they've been to the Smithsonian, but it's so much more than any of us can imagine, and it continues to grow. How did it start? How did the Smithsonian begin?
Well, it's a great story because it started with a Britishman, James Smithson. That's who it's named after. Grew up in the late 1700s. He was a believer in the Enlightenment. He was a scientist, a mineralogist, and a chemist. And he really believed knowledge was the way you could get to a great society. But he was the son of an aristocrat, and he was a little peeved at British society because it didn't allow, he was denied his birthright. He knew about Benjamin Franklin, he knew about Thomas Jefferson, he knew about this young country across the Atlantic. You know, in the early 1800s, British had now done 2 wars with America, and he made some money off of steam engines, early steam engines and canals. And he had a fortune. He was PO'd at the British. He had bet on the French Revolution, didn't work out so well. And so he sat down in London and wrote out a will. And he said, I leave my fortune, at that time it was $500,000, which was the equivalent of about $100 million today, which is a little money. And basically he said, I leave my money to the people of the United States to found in Washington an institution dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge. A lovely Enlightenment phrase. And so his money started the Smithsonian. He had never come to the United States, never set foot on it. So you think about other countries where ministries set up a national museum, you know, the Ministry of Culture in the government. Our National Museum of the United States was set up by a British guy who believed in knowledge and democracy. Combine those two, knowledge and democracy, what a force. He didn't think he was seeing that in Europe. He had the promise that that could be realized in America.
Well, of course, if you think about it, think of how America continues to change, and you're the place where those changes take place. The original people who started the Smithsonian, the original founders, what did they imagine they were doing?
Oh, they didn't know what they were doing. So everybody had their own agenda. At that time, you're talking Smithson's money came to the United States. It took Congress 9 or 10 years to debate what to do with the money. What does the increase in diffusion of knowledge look like anyway? And so Congress did then what it does now, which is think about it, debate it, argue about it. People had different ideas. Some people wanted to have a university, increase in diffusion of knowledge. Other people wanted a library. John Quincy Adams wanted a telescope. People who were part of that whole movement toward land-grant colleges wanted to use the money to have experimental plots to grow crops on the mall as an experimental college because that was our biggest industry, agriculture. So there was a lot of argument. They couldn't figure it out. They vested control in the Smithsonian and a Board of Regents, the Chief Justice of the United States, the Vice President, 3 senators, 3 representatives, and 9 citizen members.
Your chairman is the Chief Justice?
Yes.
By charter.
Yes.
So whoever the Chief Justice is always the chairman of your board.
That's correct. The vice president's on it, and this we probably violate the Constitution. I don't know if our lawyers will see this later and get on my case.
But they'll have to take it to the Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice.
Which is why it violates the separation of powers. But the 9 citizens tend to keep the place honest.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and it's incredible. One of the things that's so remarkable, just we won't really focus on this one so much, but is Folkways Records and the whole, that's part of your world.
Yes, yeah, I helped bring Folkways Records to the
Folkways,
Smithsonian.
any of you as kids listen to Folkways, I used to listen to all Ledbetter and stuff, and that's
Woody
all
Guthrie, This Land Is Your Land,
that's
We
all
Shall
part
Overcome.
of their world.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's incredible, the range of things, and it doesn't stop. I mean, this last year, you opened another revelation.
Yeah.
Which everybody here, by the way, wants to go to.
Well, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the black market price for getting, there's a waiting list of about 3 million people to get in. The black market price is 2 tickets to Hamilton.
or sitting in this audience and
Right.
coming up to talk to Richard Cowan
Yeah,
afterwards.
so
The 2 tricks,
yeah,
2 ways
yeah.
of getting.
But it's a great, Smithsonian has 19 museums. We get about 30 million people a year that come to it, hundreds of millions of more access online or through Smithsonian Magazine or through Smithsonian Channel. And we work in 145 countries. What a lot of people don't know is we operate things that are not even in our museums. So we operate telescopes in Chile, on the Big Island of Hawaii. We run 6 missions for NASA. We have a tropical research institute with 600 people in Panama doing work on coral reefs. We figure out how to breed pandas because we operate the National Zoo. We save species and cultures around the world. So it's a big operation. It's about $1.5 billion budget, about 6,500 employees and partnerships with hundreds and hundreds of institutions around the world.
It's such a treasure, and I think people only have a little fraction of an idea, although we have a couple of your board members or former board members who are here, and I think they have a sense of it. And by the way, if you besides want to go for free to the Natural History, to the African American Museum, want to make a contribution of a couple of $1 million, Richard's here for that too. But it's also thought of as the nation's attic. Where does that concept come from, and what the heck's in there? I mean, I want to talk about some specific things in the attic in a moment, but where does the concept of it being an attic, and how do people, anybody have an attic that you're trying to get, who's done spring cleaning recently? Where do we give things? So how do you do that?
Well, don't solicit yet. We're very careful about that. So it's a little hard. So, the Smithsonian has all these museums on the National Mall, and you've been to many of them. And this is why it's called the Nation Attic. That's what it looks like behind the scenes. So that's a part of a bird collection of about 3.5, 4 million birds. So the Smithsonian has 156 million items in its collection. That's not counting photographs or archives or anything, just stuff. And that stuff ranges from the Space Shuttle Discovery, to 6.4 million stamps, to prehistoric shrimp, to really the treasures of our country. Wonderful jewelry, which we'll get to in a moment. I think the attic became, because the Smithsonian became very early on the repository of the U.S. collections. When the Smithsonian was established in 1846, Congress decreed that all the collections of the United States would go to the Smithsonian. Heretofore, they were kind of scattered around. The State Department had some, and the Navy had some from expeditions. So all that stuff came to the Smithsonian. Once we acquired that, people kept sending stuff. More and more stuff. Stuff is the technical name for collections.
Stuff. So how do you decide which stuff to actually keep?
Well, the curators do that, and because it has to be significant, and 9 times out of 10, probably more than 9 times out of 10, people will come to us and say, here's my Uncle Joe's walking stick. You got to know Uncle Joe. He was a great guy. It's a beautiful stick. He picked it up. He carved it himself. And they imagine that, oh, yeah, we'll take it. And then 2 weeks later, they'll come to the National Museum of American History on the Mall, and there'll be under a spotlight, Uncle Joe's walking stick. We've got a lot of walking sticks. So the attic is the fact that if you come to the Smithsonian when you visit it, only about 1% of our collection is ever on display. The rest of it is not quite in an attic, but it's in 850 other buildings that the Smithsonian, 850. Now, if you remember, how many people saw Indiana Jones, that last scene with the Ark, right, when they're saying we're taking care of it, and you see this massive storeroom? That's exactly what it's like. And some things you have to store under particular conditions. We have a lot of wet parts of animals and organisms. We have the National Meteorite Collection. Now, we don't know if there's any alien life on those meteors. So we have to keep that in a special room. And then we have, you know, a collection at the National Zoo of a bunch of pandas and 2,250 other animals. So taking care of all that, I think people came up with the idea. It could have been a garage or an attic, but the idea is we spent a lot of money taking care of those objects so they could be used for research, for science, and for display,
Now,
and
I
loaning
told you,
out.
one of my little weird experiences is that my first book, the book had to do Norman Lear and the Family Hour and television in the 70s, and it was the last use of the set of All in the Family, which in those days every American saw. And the last use was a book party for my book, and it went to you. Well, what did you do with that set of All in the Family?
So All of the Family was in part of a display of the National Museum of American History for a really long time because we looked at, among other things, among George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the Star-Spangled Banner and anything, we were looking at popular culture in America. And of course, All in the Family was really part, for those of a certain age, we're really part of that popular culture of who we are. Now, there's a postscript to that, and I think we were talking before.
Yeah.
So I saw Norman Lear a few weeks ago. He was there in Washington for the Kennedy Center Honors, and one of the things they did for the Kennedy Center Honors was to show the sets of the different shows that Norman had produced, All in the Family, Maude, the Jeffersons, and so on. And so the Kennedy Center said, hey, do you have that furniture? Can we borrow that? Well, you know, it sends the curators apoplectic. This is old, worn out, you know, living room furniture, and, you know, we're handling it like, you know, it's a national treasure. So it is, and it's a pleasure for us to do that. At any one time, we have about 5.5 million objects loaned out to other museums across the country and across the world. 5.5 million objects.
You know, before we begin to go through objects, we're going to go through some objects, and then, by the way, I'm going to give you a little chance to ask questions you've always wanted to ask. As you know, I had an association with the Annenbergs for years, still do. Is there any Annenberg-elia in the...
Yes.
We have a lot of it at Sunnylands, of course, but what's the Annenberg connection?
Well, Walter, of course, donated to the Smithsonian, so he was a donor and supporter. A lot of people, you know, have a question about, like, the Smithsonian. Isn't that like government and but they have the Smithsonian Magazine, and they have the shops, and they make money, and they have this endowment. The Smithsonian gets about 60% of its money from the federal government and 40% from philanthropy, from donors, sponsors, supporters, companies. And so on. The recent museum, the African American Museum, we had 140,000 donors to that museum. We raised over $400 million for that museum. Privately, the U.S. government put up $270 million. So we rely on philanthropy. The Annenbergs were great philanthropists.
Patriotic philanthropy.
Patriotic philanthropy, and it's a wonderful concept, and they did that. So Walter donated. The foundation has donated over the years. And then Janet Annenberg Hooker, sister, she donated the funds for, and some jewelry.
Which Marna asked her. We'll talk about that later.
But she donated some jewelry and funds for the National Gem Collection, in which the Hope Diamond now sits. So she did that. It was a very generous donation. And then one of the Annenberg donations that I realize every day in my job is right behind the Smithsonian Castle there on the Mall is the Haupt Garden, the Enid Haupt Garden. Enid Haupt was a sister.
A sister who actually had the art collection that started him as such a great art collector. So you've written this book, by the way. This is the paperback. If you want to get the hardback, it's even another 20 pounds. but it's deservedly a large. How did you happen to write this book?
Well, so there's a British guy, and I have some of my British colleagues here in the audience as well. It was a guy, Neil McGregor, the head of the British Museum. He did a series of podcasts and wrote a book called The History of the World in 100 Objects. Very popular, bestseller in Great Britain. It did very well here and around the world. And so the publisher of that was Penguin. They said, hey, you know, British Museum head, he did a thing. We should do one on America. So I said, well, that's a good idea. I'm not really a historian. I'm an anthropologist, but I've worked at the Smithsonian for 42 years. I know a lot about the objects. And I have, you know, a few hundred curators behind me to help me. And I asked my wife, should I do it or not? My wife is a school teacher, elementary school, public school. She said, you have to do it. Kids in this country do not know about their history. We're just not teaching that history in the schools anymore. So she said, do it and write it in such a way that it's very accessible, you know, not with a, certainly well-researched and all of that, but really accessible. So I agreed to do it, only I had one condition. Penguin said, what's the condition? They were worried I would say something fancy. I said, well, Neil's British. They had 100 objects. We're American. We need 101.
And Smithson.
So that's how it came about.
And Smithson would have wanted that too.
Yeah, I think Smithson would be amazed. I think he envisioned a kind of scholarly society of, gentlemen drinking sherry and talking about the latest. I think he'd be shocked and amazed that the Smithsonian has become what it's become.
So let's look at a couple of these objects. And, you've been there, but what have you seen there? And this is what's in the book. And we're going to go through, begin with a little chronology, I suppose, with Pocahontas.
Well,
and by the way, we can't see these screens,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So if we get the sequencing wrong or something's blurred, just put up your hand and correct this.
Yeah. So, this is a good beginning. I mean, we have, look, we have at the Smithsonian documentation of the first Americans that happened to be multicellular creatures from the Precambrian era, about 500 million years ago. But skipping forward, to Jamestown, Pocahontas is an iconic figure at the Smithsonian. We have a wonderful portrait done of her. She visited England. In 1616, she ended up dying in Kent, Gravesend, in 1617. And this is a portrait of her, and it's a really telling portrait. As authors write books, we're used to telling stories in words. And in a museum, you have to tell stories with objects. It's a different kind of thing. So you really have to interrogate the object because it's not that clear. Objects speak, but sometimes they babble. I find this portrait so instructive. On your left-hand side is a portrait it's a woodcut that had been done by a book issued in 1618, just after Pocahontas died. And you could see her features. You could see her high cheekbones. You could see the nature of her stare and greeting. And then you see a color portrait that was done a year after that representing her. Now notice what she's wearing. She's represented as an Indian princess, but what kind of clothing is she wearing? She's in British regalia, as you would find. She was treated as a queen, the daughter of an emperor of the American Indians. The telling thing about this is she's presented, the words and so on that accompany it, present her as a Christian. This portrait is not meant to be a historical documentation of Pocahontas. This was an advertisement. Jamestown was failing. Jamestown was intended to be a commercial colony. It was founded by the Virginia-London Company. It was supposed to make money. People invested. It wasn't done by the crown. The colony, people starved. They were up at one point to 500 people. They were down to 50 people. 450 people died. They couldn't eat food. They were always fighting with the Indians. And so the company was worried that they wouldn't be able to pay off on the stock. The investors were really upset. And so the purpose of Jamestown shifts. And it shifts from a commercial venture in the New World, competing with possibly the French and the Spanish, to advertising, here are our Native Americans, they are heathen people, and now they're coming good Christians. Now you see how Pocahontas, even her features change in a year in Great Britain. She becomes much whiter. Her features become much more anglicized. And so this is a way of showing that our mission in Jamestown is not so much, don't worry about your investment in money. We're serving a greater need. We are taking heathens and making them British.
It's fascinating. By the way, one thing that's true of any museum, but I think especially true to think of our national treasure of this museum, is that in telling stories, it's always, it tries to make a point, but you don't want to make that point be propagandistic. This was propagandistic. The Enola Gay, I don't really want to get into it, but some of you remember the dispute about whether to have the Enola Gay. Every one of these things has a point to it. Let's talk about George Washington for a moment, because really with George Washington, he was making a point too.
Yeah, so here you see, George Washington had served in the British colonial army in Virginia. He fought with General Braddock, and then he became the leader of the Revolutionary Army for the United States, fighting for our freedom. Well, he did not want Americans to look like a ragtag bunch. So George Washington really helps design the uniform for officers. He wants to show the Brits, we are, we're not a bunch of, ragtag ruffian people. And so he personally designs this. Now, he has a problem. He needs to get good quality cloth, good quality wool for the uniforms. We don't produce it in the United States. Where does he get the cloth for the uniform? In Great Britain. He designs the uniform. He takes on the colors of the Fairfax Brigade, and those later become the colors for the U.S. Army. And in that famous Gilbert Stuart painting, which is in our National Portrait Gallery's uniforms in American History Museum, you could see Washington. He's holding a sword, but he's in a civilian uniform. And that's what George Washington actually used to wear, black suit. This is in Philadelphia, which was the capital before Washington. But you look at Washington, he's definitely a civilian, and the books in there are all about law and the Constitution and so on. And it may be hard to see with the glare or the sunlight, but it's a totally fictional set. Talk about propaganda. I mean, this is so iconic. The original hangs at the Smithsonian. There's a copy in the White House. When you look at that's just a knockoff from Gilbert Stuart's studio. But when you look at that, what's depicted behind Washington? It's the Roman Republic. It's Rome. And that idea of the Republic. And if you could really see through the portals there, and again, I don't know if the glare is hard. If you get the book, you'll see it very clearly.
Get the book.
It's almost like a kid's painting. Gilbert Stuart, master of painting all Revolutionary eras. Through one of those portals, you see clouds, storm clouds. And if you look through another portal, you see a rainbow. The storm clouds of revolution, the rainbow of the future. My fourth grade kids used to paint like that. So encoded in that paintings are understandings about who we thought we were as a country, where we were going, where we were coming from, and where we were going. And
of course, more or less that same period is the Star-Spangled Banner and the flag that we can see.
Yeah, you know, I love this because we all go to sporting events and other events, and everybody sings the Star-Spangled Banner. Right. I think very few Americans understand that there's actually a flag behind that. That banner is a banner.
Made that banner still wave, right?
And that is in the Smithsonian. Now that banner was bought. It's a huge flag. It's 40 feet by 32 feet. Now this is how it looks right now. It's threadbare. Yeah, Martin's right. It would fill this room.
Wow.
And the British general of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, go back 1814, August, the British come to and they land in Washington. They burn the White House. Dolly Madison rolls up that knockoff Gilbert Stuart, not the real Gilbert Stuart, Washington. They burn the Capitol, they burn other public buildings in Washington, and they march toward Baltimore. If the British Army can defeat Baltimore, we will not be an independent country. Baltimore is key to our shipping, our trade, the whole mid-Atlantic. Fort McHenry stands in the way. The commanding major of Fort McHenry, a guy named Amistad, in 1813, bought this big, humongous flag. He bought it for $405. It was made. They had to make it outside and then in a bar, appropriately, because they needed the room to make it 40 feet by 32 feet, had it over the fort. The British, on September 13th, night of 13th, it's a terrible, terrible storm. Lightning, thunder, rain. You have about 200 defenders of Fort McHenry, and they're being bombarded by the British Navy. And if that fort falls, the country falls. Well, Francis Scott Key was a lawyer. He's out in Chesapeake Bay. He was trying to negotiate the freedom for a prisoner. And so he knew what the plan was. He's out on the bay, and he's looking at that fort, undergoing this fuselage all night. And in dawn's early light, remember the words, in dawn's early, and during the night it was bombs bursting in air, rockets were good. That is absolutely true. Dawn's early light, he's waiting for the dawn. If he sees the Union Jack over that fort, he knows there's no more United States. If he sees that big flag, Francis Scott Key, he knows we still have a country. And in dawn's early light, he sees this flag. He has in his head a song, and he composes a poem for that song. And we know those words of that song right now. The song in his head, a drinking song to Anacreon in heaven. The United States is the only country on the planet whose national anthem is based on a drinking song.
Sounds appropriate since the flag was made in a bar.
But it took a lot to preserve it. After that, it was paraded. People cut pieces out of it. It was hung up outside the Smithsonian on the Mall. And it took a number of stewardesses in the early 1900s to actually repair it because it was loved to death. People regarded it as a sacred relic. They took pieces out of it. And then we put it back together. This gives you a size of what it did. We had to restore it again in the 1990s, Save America's Treasures program, which was a great program. You see the stars of those stripes. The stripes are 2 feet wide. The flag he bought made for $405. It ended up costing us to take care of it, house it, put it in a special room, take care of it, $58 million.
Wow. And by the way, you couldn't put a value on it if
It's
somebody wanted to buy
unique,
it.
totally unique.
Couldn't do it.
Totally unique.
Well, let's talk about, skipping ahead a few years, Abraham Lincoln famously wore a hat. Do you have that in the museum?
Yeah, this is, yeah. That's Abraham Lincoln's hat. It's the hat he wore when he was, the night he was assassinated, April 14th, 1865. He went to Ford's Theater. He sat down in chairs like we're sitting. He was in a box in Ford's Theater, a few blocks from the White House. Civil War had just been won 10 days earlier. This was a celebration. He got a standing ovation at Ford's Theater, put the hat down, and was assassinated. Well, it was shot and then carried across the street.
Is that a hat box? Gosh, everybody said a hat box. What's in your hat box? We'll find out. I'm going to poke around to see if it's the real hat.
Oh, it has its own plane. Airport's free.
Okay, so you look at Lincoln's hat, and it's an amazing piece of work. They didn't have sizes then, so there's no tag inside of it. It has Lincoln's sweat stains and so on, and rips and tears. And it didn't come with this band. Lincoln put this band on. Now, Lincoln put this band on because his son, Willie, died during the Civil War, and he wanted to show his empathy with other parents who lost their children. And so he added this band. He used to put papers in here. Lincoln was 6'4". And his generals didn't like him wearing a hat.
I think it would fit me.
It would fit you, but he had a small head. Actually, it was about size. It would be about size 7 1/8 today. So it's just a marvelous piece. You want to hold that? No,
Yeah,
no. It started out black. He wore it because Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, started that tradition of wearing top hats. And Lincoln, don't put it on, Jeff. Lincoln, and be careful. If you drop it, it's a felony. But it was a mark of urban respectability. Lincoln was a backwoods guy, and wearing a top hat showed sophistication,
Interesting.
which he needed. What's it made out of? So it's made out of silk and cloth. Now, before anybody gets too nervous, it is a copy. So I just, but look.
These are real gloves, though.
These are real gloves. But I just want to do it because it illustrates something. It illustrates something important. For a while, people believe or they're not sure. And that helps illustrate the power of objects. Okay? So you know it's not real. So, what's the point? You know, okay, cool. But if it was real, it was the present. But it's being in the presence. Objects bring us to a point, to a person, a period of history, a thing. I think objects have a magical quality. We want something to rub off on us. Wouldn't you love to say and go home, you know what? Some guy from the Smithsonian bought this. I almost touched it. That would be really cool. Yeah. And that's why people like to go to museums. They're seeing the authentic, real thing that puts them in another time, another place, that puts them in a place of beauty or a place of innovation, or a place where they feel they could participate somehow magically with those objects.
That's great. And so we're going to go through several other items,
Okay.
and I want to start with a little bit of magic if we can.
Yeah.
And it's Hollywood magic. Because I think you have Dorothy's ruby slippers.
Yeah, so these are great. I think they cost a few bucks in Culver City when they were bought. People come into American history amazingly and say, where's Dorothy's slippers? I mean, still, just like people watch The Wizard of Oz every year, you know, almost like a ritual. Dorothy's slippers came to us actually from an anonymous donor, but the provenance was good. Somebody donated to the Smithsonian back in the 70s. Now, the slippers, their size, I think these are 5C. There were several versions made. There were about 6 versions made of the slippers. And they have some felt on them, which gives us an indication they were used for dancing scenes, because they were used through the movie for different purposes. There's about 2,000 sequins sewn on fabric to each of these shoes. Why did these shoes look the way they? Why are they the ruby red slippers? If you read Frank Baum's novel about the Wizard of Oz, his books that were written in 1900, the slippers are silver. The Emerald City is Washington, D.C. The Tin Man is the industrial vote. The Scarecrow is the fire. It's a whole play on William Jennings.
It's a very political, the actual book was a political book by Frank Baum.
Exactly. But what happens, why are these ruby red? Well, in 1938, there's a new process developed for Hollywood that makes Hollywood magic. It's called Technicolor. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs come out, okay? And so MGM wants to come out with a great feature, and The Wizard of Oz plays well. You need something that's strikingly visual.
And you're going from black and white to color.
To color, yeah. So what, silver, how does silver look out? Silver in black and white looks washed out gray. So all of a sudden in the script, and we have the script, it's changed. Silver's crossed out, and ruby red is put in. Now, but the issue was, if you hold the slippers, as I have, they're actually not ruby red. Technicolor was invented by 2 guys from MIT and another guy. That's Technicolor, MIT, Tech. And the idea was that you needed intense light for Technicolor. And so if you had them red, they would look like a burnt out orange. So when you actually hold them, they're more on the burgundy side of things, but under the intense light of Technicolor, they look ruby red.
I mean, we've got so much to discuss about all this, and I'm sorry that we won't have much of a chance for Q&A, if any. I do urge you to find Richard and buy this book, too, to talk about this more. But let's go to, moving ahead to Audie Murphy's Eisenhower jacket.
Well, this is good, especially, Susan Rockefeller's here. And
Susan Eisenhower.
Eisenhower's here. Other family. Eisenhower was a great general, engineer of victory in World War II, but he found the army jackets, the combat jackets, were too long, they were too bulky, and they didn't look so good. And so he wanted something that was better fit for combat and also would look good because he was very aware of the image of the army.
Again, the image.
And so his tailor ended up doing this. They made one of a kind for Ike based on another army jacket. He loved it, and all of a sudden everybody started imitating Eisenhower, and this became the Ike jacket. It was then imitated after the war by the Postal Service and many others, only they did it in blue, not in the khaki green. And this is Audie Murphy's, the one we have a few of Ike's jackets at the Smithsonian. This one was Audie Murphy, the most decorated Army hero of World War II.
And Jackie Kennedy's inaugural gown.
Do we have, whoop? That doesn't look like Jackie. Oh, I must be out of order. Okay, well, we'll have Jackie Kennedy's.
We'll skip that.
Hope Diamond,
is up there? Should we talk about the Hope Diamond? Okay, so because Marna was hoping for the Hope Diamond.
Yeah. Well, you see the package, right? Came from Harry Winston's. The postage on that. See that?
$2.66.
$2.66. Harry Winston put it in the mail from New York. Took it on the subway, sent it in the mail, and in it was the Hope Diamond. Which is pretty good. And it was set in an elaborate box, and of course it's been at the center of the Janet Hooker, Annenberg Hooker, and it's 45 carat blue diamond. Some people think it's worth about $300 million or so. Very famous, thought to be cursed, and has been implicated in a lot of stories, actually, with the White House and First Ladies.
Do they have a right to wear it?
That was a big thing with Jackie Kennedy, that Harry Winston really imagined. He thought we were a third-rate country because we had just won World War II, but we didn't have crown jewels. The reason we didn't have crown jewels is we didn't have a crown. So Harry Winston was going to invent it. In the 50s, he developed the Court of Jewels. He got a lot of big diamonds, and he got models around the country to wear it for charity. I actually met some women, quite elderly, who had worn it in the 1950s for charity events, like for cystic fibrosis and other diseases. So Harry felt he needed to donate it to the country. It was another act of patriotic philanthropy. We said, I'll give the Hope Diamond, and then other people will imitate it. And they did. And the Post did, Merriweather Post, Janet Annenberg, and others, to give us one of the probably the best collection of national
And people
gems.
have tried to wear it, though. Have first ladies tried to wear it? Or how does that all work?
Well, so to my knowledge, no first ladies have worn it, but they became implicated with it at the Smithsonian when Jackie Kennedy was in the White House. You remember Charles de Gaulle? Sure. Okay, so Charles de Gaulle, he wanted it because originally it came from India, but it had been part of the French crown jewels and was stolen. And de Gaulle wanted to do an exhibit at the Louvre reuniting the French crown jewels, something Napoleon couldn't do, he wanted to do. He asked the Smithsonian, could you give us that blue diamond you have over there? What do you think we said? No way, well, you know. But he persisted. He called Jackie Kennedy. And Jackie Kennedy really, was a fan of French culture. And she said, she called the head of the Smithsonian and said, I think you should lend it. The head of the Smithsonian was apoplectic. What do I do? He calls his boss. As Geoff said, the head of the Smithsonian's board is the Chief Justice, so she calls Earl Warren, a guy from California. Head of the Chief, says, do I have to listen to Jackie Kennedy? Earl Warren says, I think you do. So we sent the Hope Diamond to the Louvre, to France for an exhibit in May, but lest you think Smithsonian museum curators are silly or stupid, we did what any good curator could do. We took a hostage. And so we sent the Hope Diamond to Charles de Gaulle in France, and in return, they sent us Mona Lisa.
Did you have it on display?
Yeah, it was on display at the National Gallery, and then it went up to the Met. The real Mona Lisa at that time. They didn't have 3D printing like we do. No. But the guy from the Smithsonian put the French sent Mona Lisa in a whole escort of ships and, the French Navy and everything. We sent the Hope Diamond in the pocket of the curator on a commercial flight.
So at least that's better than being in that package, I suppose. Richard, I'll make a quick announcement for 2 other appearances you're making, and then we'll go through a few more objects. But he's going to be talking about the African American Museum, so you should know about that, with Linda Johnson Rice. And he's also going to be talking about another part of what you do and what the Smithsonian does that's very important, which is preserving national treasures around the world.
Right. And we're very active these days in Iraq and Syria. We worked in Haiti after the earthquake. We now have a team on the ground, well, right now in Puerto Rico, helping them. We helped out in South Texas after the flooding. We helped out in New York after Superstorm Sandy. We've helped out in the deserts of Mali after extremists were burning manuscripts.
It's another great function of the Smithsonian. But we have a couple more items. Hopefully the next one won't suggest that we're ever going to need to protect American artifacts quite that way. Yeah. But you've protected a fallout shelter.
Yeah, okay, let me just shift that. Just a fast thing on this, because Nancy Reagan, I got involved with the Hope Diamond and Nancy Reagan in 1985 when we had an exhibit on India. And the head of the Smithsonian said, I want to display this. Rajiv Gandhi from India is coming. Nancy Reagan's going to host a dinner. Let's have it. And I said, what are you, crazy? Like, he could ask for it back. What are we going to do? Of course, there's a picture of when Nancy Reagan discovered that she was sitting under a gem that might have been cursed. This is Jackie Kennedy's gown, absolutely beautiful. Nothing I could say, just absolutely gorgeous. But Jackie Kennedy was 31 years old. 31, think about that, 31 years old when she became First Lady. So this signaled that whole Camelot, that whole style, really forward-looking. So this is what Geoff really likes. We talked about this a lot. This is a fallout shelter. Now think of it as Cold War aesthetic. But the Smithsonian got this in Indiana.
Well, I also thought, Richard, we just lived through this. I mean, in Hawaii, they were running to fallout shelters. So this is history, but it's also kind of today.
And it reminds you of how, how terrible that could be. you know, just how terrible. And I think in the 50s, some of us might remember, you know, the get under the dusk and roll and duck and cover and things like that, and all the fallout shelter signs. And so we lived with this. We lived with this. And the prospect of living it again and consigning our life to a place like that is not a happy prospect.
And this is kind of a result of the worst uses of technology, but at the same time, you've got something that's one of the most magnificent uses of technology, which is the space program.
Yeah, so I love this because Neil Armstrong, again, many of us watched on TV as Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And what we don't realize is, you know, this was a great technological, scientific accomplishment. It was a great act of national will to see this through, to see the space program through. And I count myself very lucky. Somebody who held my position before I did years ago, who I've met several times, is Mike Collins. He commanded the command module for Apollo 11. And so I say jokingly around to Mike, you know, you had to go to the moon and back to get this job. I just had to walk up a flight of stairs at the Smithsonian. But what people don't know is where innovation comes from. You know, we talk about innovation a lot. We talk about our society a lot. Innovation comes from the strangest quarter. Neil Armstrong's spacesuit, to walk on the moon, how does that happen? You need a great spacesuit. When NASA let the contracts in the early 60s, it was all these high-tech companies. It was going to be plastic and titanium and all these materials. And if you did it like that, you'd never move on the moon because you needed flexibility. They relet the contract. Who won the contract to design the spacesuit? Playtex. Playtex, because Playtex knew about layering and movement. So whenever you hear that saying, Neil Armstrong took a giant step for humanity, took an even bigger step for ladies' undergarments. But that's where the innovation came from, brassieres and girdles.
But by the way, it's a piece that shows us our innovation doesn't stop, and it's going to continue. You know, it's so exciting to realize this. It seemed impossible, and we did it, and American innovation can do that. And I just want to sort of end this piece, and if we have another minute, maybe we'll get one question, with something else that shows how far America has come, and that's the Greensboro lunch counter.
Yeah, and this, you know, this is an item. It's an unassuming Woolworth's lunch counter. But it's where in February 1960, 4 young men from North Carolina State sat down to stand up for their rights. A&M, it was A&M. Sat down to stand up for their rights. And then they were joined by women from Bennett College and others, even high school students. And it really kicked off youth involvement in the civil rights movement, and we're glad it did. It came to the Smithsonian. Lonnie Bunch, the current director of the African American Museum, collected that when he was a curator at the American History Museum, and they cut out a section of that, and that's at the Smithsonian. It reminds us every day of how far we come, and sometimes it reminds us of how far we have to go.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take about 2 questions if we can, and if you can shout them, and I'll try to repeat them. By the way, if I could interrupt for another commercial, one of my colleagues has written a book called The Feather Thief, which is about the theft of feathers from the British Museum going back to Darwin's feathers. So that's a real question. How do you protect all this? How do you deal with all that?
Hard to do in 18 seconds, but the Smithsonian, has a lot of, it's big staff, 6,500 people, collections managers, security, a lot of, I don't have my badges on, but we're very careful about the national collections. Yeah, nobody can, yeah. Even among staff, there's, yeah. Yeah, typically the directors of the museum have the call unless we have to overrule them, and I've done that a few times in my career.
I think this is all we're going to have time for. Again, Richard's around to talk to me. He's talking 2 more times. There's a book here to buy. There's an incredible range of museums to go to. Please join me in thanking Richard for this amazing presentation.